Good morning and welcome to session 4 of Understanding LDS History, the Pioneer Years, where we're looking at the period in history from 1844 to 1877 in LDS history, and I appreciate you joining us for that. And as always, I just want to say right up front, my intent in all of these classes is to be truthful and to be honest, but I do want to, as best as humanly possible, to the best of my ability, I want to do so with gentleness and with respect. And there's a lot of areas where, as evangelical Christians, we would disagree with our LDS neighbors on a lot of issues, and I think we can disagree without being disagreeable. And so I want to do so with gentleness and respect. I want to keep the command of Scripture that my speech will always be gracious. And I want to be gracious in discussing our differences. And if you're here in your LDS or you've stumbled across these videos online in your LDS, we would love to sit down and talk to you. I think we can do so in a way that will be friendly and loving and kind, and we can talk about our differences without being disagreeable. And you can reach out to me through our church website, redemptionutah.com. We'd love to get together and have a discussion with you. But that's my goal every week. All right, week 4, and we've made it about 3 days in our progress through history. So I don't know how many sessions this is going to end up being, but somewhere along the way we'll get going faster, because today we're actually going to go backwards from 1844. But when all the dust had settled, we talked about Joseph Smith died in the summer of 1844. When all of the dust had settled, the church voted to give leadership of the church to the 12 apostles. We've looked at in recent weeks some of the splinter groups and factions that split off at that time, but the main body of the church, when all was said and done, all the other groups that were started, the main body of the church stayed with this group that originally, remember, and this is an important point, the agreement was, what they voted was to give leadership to the 12 apostles as a body, not to one man as a whole. And even Brigham Young was in agreement with that when it all took place, when it first happened. He said at the time there would never be anybody that would take Joseph Smith's place as the prophet, a prophet kind of leader of the church. Brigham Young said Joseph Smith was unique in that regard. And we mentioned this several weeks ago, but the Times and Seasons, the newspaper, the LDS newspaper, ran an article a week after this decision was made where they printed this column from the 12 apostles, but was penned by Brigham Young, or dictated by Brigham Young. And part of that says, "You are now without a prophet present with you in the flesh to guide you." And the top of that second column says, "Let no man presume for a moment that his place," that's Joseph Smith, "don't presume that his place will ever be filled by another. For remember, he stands in his own place, and he always will. And the 12 apostles of this dispensation stand in their own place and always will." Well, it turns out that didn't exactly end up being the case. Despite what Brigham Young said, in a fairly short period of time, he sees pretty much sole control of the church with himself at the head. In fact, you find him saying, this happened in August. In October of that same year at the General Conference, Brigham Young said this, "If you don't know whose right it is to give you revelations, I'll tell you. It's me." It's a pretty confident statement to make. And you think about it in a day and age that wasn't a lot different, even sometimes even in our own day and age. All right, when somebody tells you that God told them something, how do you know God really told them? And see, it's one thing for me to feel like I have a revelation. For me, if I go, I feel like God led me to move to Utah. It's another thing if I come to you and go, God told me to tell you to move to Utah, and to have revelations for others. And there was a lot of people claiming to get special revelation from God during this time period. Brigham Young had initially said that was a role only Joseph Smith could fill. But we see by October he's saying, no, if you want to know who gets revelations for this church to tell you what we're supposed to do, I'm the guy. So by December of 1847, this was 1844, but by 1847, he had become so powerful, he was able to reorganize the church's entire leadership structure with himself as the absolute head. And he set up the first presidency with the two counselors. We talked about when Joseph Smith died, he'd established a lot of bodies, but not a lot of structure. And Brigham Young structurized all of that and continues to this day to be the structure that the church uses. But here's the amazing thing to me. When he took over in 1844, church membership was 26,000. When he died in 1877, it was 115,000 members. So the church had remarkable growth under Brigham Young. I mentioned this before. I can't prove this one way or the other. This is totally my opinion. I think the reason the LDS Church exists today is because of Brigham Young. Now, Joseph Smith was charismatic, he was charming, he was brilliant in a lot of ways. He was visionary in the sense of, he said God told him a lot of stuff, not visionary in the sense of seeing down the road and what 3 steps later what we need to do. Joseph Smith was always he was reactionary to what was going on in the moment and just reacted, but he wasn't great at seeing next steps we need to take way down the road. And that's why you see under Joseph Smith, every problem that came up, his answer was just to have a revelation to handle it. And if he's having an issue with somebody, God would just tell him to, God said for you to do this. And he was always very reactionary. Brigham Young's leadership was very different. And just looking at it from an objective standpoint, Brigham Young was probably one of the great leaders of the 19th century. I would argue one of the great figures in all of American history in the 19th century, one of the most important figures in American history in the 19th century, I think, was Brigham Young, but certainly for the LDS Church. And he was that visionary in the sense of being able to plan ahead and think next steps and what do we need to do. And a powerful figure in terms of he had a personality, and we'll see this along the way, he had a personality that he could get people on board with the plan, and if you didn't like the plan, he'd tell you where to go. And but by and large, he got people on board and led the church through some incredibly difficult and hard times, and they loved him for it. By the time they get to Utah and he is set up, he was the territorial governor for the Utah Territory for many, many years. And he did what he wanted to do, and he'd tell the United States government where to go. And that kind of powerful figure and a larger-than-life guy in a lot of ways. And 1844, there were a lot of movements similar to the LDS Church. There was a lot of restorationist movements that popped up that said, like the LDS Church said, we are the restored church. All the other churches are apostate. We're the real deal. There were a lot of other millennial groups, like the LDS Church was very much a millennial movement when it started, in that Joseph Smith said, Jesus is coming back in our lifetime. It's going to happen. And there were other groups saying the same thing at the same time. There were other groups like the LDS Church saying we're the restoration of true Israel. We are the lost tribes, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That's us. Other groups were saying all of these same kinds of things. There were the Shakers and the Oneida community and a lot of other movements that were very similar in their ideology. And none of those movements lasted. But the LDS Church not only lasted, it flourished. And I think that's largely because of Brigham Young. Had Joseph Smith lived, I seriously wonder whether the church would have survived in the long term. So he was a powerful, powerful leader and an important figure. And so I think it's important then for us to take enough time to go back and get to know him a little bit and go, how did he get to this point where he is in 1847 and he becomes this larger-than-life figure? How did we get there? So to do that, we're going to go all the way back to 1801, when Brigham Young was born. So Joseph Smith was born in 1805, so Brigham Young's actually 4 years older than Smith. And he has an interesting family history. His grandfather was a physician in Massachusetts and was a veteran of the French and Indian War. And his dad, John Young, served 3 campaigns in the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War underneath George Washington. And John Young, his father, grew up in, his paternal grandmother died very young when John Young and his brother were both just children. And his dad died. His mom sold both of them into basically indentured servitude, where she sold them to somebody else to work for them at like 6 and 8, right? Here's my kid, put him to work. And so basically indentured servanthood. They grew up very, very poor. And John, when he married Abigail Howe, so Brigham's mom, in 1785, and like a lot of other people wanting a better life, they relocated the family to Vermont, where they had, with their 8 kids. And the more I study this period of history, the more I go, man, we are such a bunch of sissies. We are just wusses, and that we cannot deal with life. And we're all going, I'm so stressed and life's so hard. And we have no idea what hard is. Right? They go to Vermont. If you've ever been to Vermont, everything's a jungle, right? And if you own a farm and you think about the tools you had to clear land in 1800, he moves to Vermont and tries to eke out a living as a farmer, where they're clearing land and, pulling rocks out of the ground and trying to survive on a dirt poor farm. And on that farm, in a 1-room house with already 8 kids. That's where Brigham Young was born as the 9th child in 11 total children that Abigail would have. Things didn't work out well in Vermont, and so with a lot of other people, he moved his family to western New York as part of York Fever in 1804. Western New York was still the frontier in the early 1800s, and people were flocking there for the American dream. We're going to go have a better life. We can make something of ourselves. And he moved the family there, where it was just like no better than Vermont. They were trying to eke by on a farm, incredibly, incredibly poor. Brigham said, when I was a kid, instead of going to school, I had to chop logs, to sow and plant in the midst of roots, barefooted. And if I had on a pair of pants that would cover me, I did pretty good. So grew up just really, really in abject poverty, struggling to survive. Religiously speaking, that part of western New York, you might recall, same part of the state that Joseph Smith was from, was called the Burnt Over District by historians, because one of the most religious places on the planet was New York in the early 1800s. And so just burnt over with the Holy Spirit, kind of the idea. Churches on top of churches, and religious movements on top of religious movements, and denominations and revivals. This is the same time as the Great Awakening. And so a lot of revivals and just a lot of religious intensity. And sometime in that period, the Young family joined the United Methodist Church. And you have to, when you think Methodist today, if you're familiar with denominations at all, Methodists in 1800 were not the same as Methodists today. When you think United Methodist today, that's a very liberal denomination and very liberal ideology. They would have been the opposite in 1800, and highly conservative theologically. And Methodists especially were known for circuit riding preachers in this time, who just travel around preaching anywhere they could get an audience. And there were so many of them in this part of New York that it led to the saying, if there was bad weather, if it's raining outside, somebody might say, there's nothing out today but crows and Methodist preachers. And so that's kind of the religious kind of atmosphere that Brigham Young came up in. In 1807, she gave birth to her last child, Lorenzo Dow Young, Brigham's younger brother, after a well-known Methodist preacher, which was a common practice of that day to name your kids after preachers you admired and respected. She named him after Lorenzo Dow, the who had a nickname of Crazy Dal, because he was very enthusiastic in his preaching. And so he was named after him. The Methodism of that time that they were part of was, like I said, very, I would say, legalistic in its standards. And so Brigham grew up in a house where he wasn't allowed to swear or dance. Music was forbidden. They had strict observance of the Sabbath. And so, recalling his childhood, Brigham Young said, "I never had a chance to dance when I was young, and I never heard the enchanting tones of the violin until I was 11 years of age. And then I thought I was on the highway to hell." Because he heard a violin. I wonder what he would have thought of, I don't know, Black Sabbath. I don't know. But that's the kind of atmosphere he grew up in. And as an adult, he learned to love music. He loved the violin, and he loved dancing. With his dad, who was very stern, he said, "With my dad, it used to be a word and a blow, but the blow usually came first." His mom was the opposite. She taught us all to honor the name of the Father and the Son and to reverence the Holy Book. So he grew up in a highly religious household, as most would have been at the time. After Lorenzo was young, his mom became very ill with, they called it consumption at the time, tuberculosis, and it was very handicapped the last few years of his life. She passed away in 1813 when Brigham was just 12, leaving his dad. A lot of the older kids were gone, but he's like, how can I care for these kids? So he sent the younger kids off to live with grown siblings, and he took Brigham and Lorenzo and moved to another city in New York, where he started all over again. And in doing that, he was gone a lot, trying to farm his little plot, but also hiring himself out to others just to try to make ends meet. So when they were really young still, like 8 and 9, Brigham and Lorenzo were often just left alone to fend for themselves. And he recalled a time later in life where his dad had been gone for days, and we don't even know when Dad's coming back. And they're like 8 and 9. And Brigham managed to kill a robin because they had no food. They killed a robin, and they survived. And I can't imagine there's very much meat on a robin for one person, much less two. But that's how they were trying to scrape by at the time. When Brigham was 16, John got remarried and told him, "It's time for you to leave home," which might sound harsh, but it wasn't unusual in that day and age for boys to leave home at that age. And so he told them when he got remarried, "Hey, you're a man now, it's time to make it on your own." So Brigham moved to Auburn, New York, so he could be close to his adult siblings. And there he apprenticed himself to a furniture maker, who taught him to make various kinds of furniture, and that actually became his craft for many years. And he was a hard worker, and as a painter and a joiner, a carpenter, and a furniture maker, he made a name for himself. And over the next few years, he helped to build, and he's still a teenager, early 20s in this period. He helped build Auburn Theological Seminary and the house that's in these pictures that's still there today. This is the home of William Seward, who was going to become the governor of New York, and he was President Lincoln's Secretary of State. And so if you go in that home today, you can go to this parlor, and the fireplace in that parlor was actually built by Brigham Young when he was just a young man. And so kind of neat that stuff like that is still there. He began to learn his trade there, and he began to show early on the trait that he would have all of his life, that he was not a guy you could push into making a decision. And he would do what he wanted to do, but he didn't react well to being pushed into doing something. And some of you probably have a temperament like that, you don't react well to being forced. If you come to the conclusion on your own, you'll end up doing what everybody else is doing, but you have to feel like you came to it yourself. And sometimes you don't want to do things, like, for instance, I have never seen the movie Titanic, only because so many people kept telling me I had to. Right? In the late 90s, there's a period where everybody was watching it, and I got tired of hearing, "You've got to see it." And I went, I know what happens. So I never managed to see it, but some of that was just stubbornness. And he kind of had that. Like, for instance, he made up on his own mind that he didn't drink, but he refused to join the temperance movement, which was huge at the time. right? But he refused to join the temperance movement. He said, I don't want to feel like I'm not drinking because I swore not to or made a commitment not to, but I'm just not going to do it because it's the right thing to do. He just decided for a while he was going to be a vegetarian in a day and age when that wasn't as common as it would have been today, for sure, but some were saying it's a much healthier lifestyle. And he tried it for a while. And when a guy made fun of him and said, what sort of sissy would be a vegetarian, he essentially said, why don't you come over here and tell me that to my face? And the guy backed down. But he made decisions that way, that he would forge his own path. In his own words, he said, I'm opposed to being crowded, and I'm opposed to any person who undertakes to force me to do this or not do that. And that's a trait that he would show all of his life. Having grown up in the Burnover district in New York, in terms of his religious views, these are his words, he said he was well acquainted with the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, New Lights, Baptists, Free Will Baptists, Wesleyans, and Reformed Methodists, or more or less acquainted with every other religious ism. One of his earliest memories was hearing Lorenzo Dow, the Methodist preacher, preach, the one his brother was named after. But despite all this, as an adult, he resisted joining any kind of church or religious movement for a time. Finally, at the age of 23, after a lot of reflection, he joined a Methodist church. But he said, and this is years later, in 1849, he said, I joined the Methodists just to get rid of them and all the sects, same as the girl who married the man just to get rid of him. So just so they'll leave me alone, I'll join one, so everybody will quit bugging me. I don't know if that's the case or not, but he was a member of a Methodist church. Then in October of 1824, he met and married Miriam Angeline Works. And in 1825, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth, and they eventually settled in Mendon, New York in 1828, where his dad had also bought some property. They had a stream that he used to power a lathe that he built, which he used to build furniture. And some of that's still existing today. Here's the lathe that he used in his shop. There's a chair that was actually built by Brigham Young, and he continued to try to eke out a living making furniture. Also, when they moved to Mendon is when he established one of the most important relationships in his life, and you'll want to remember this name, and it'll be easy because we're going to see him a lot. In Mendon, he met another young man named Heber C. Kimball. And their lives are almost inseparable for the next 45 years until Brigham passed away after that. Almost every decision they made together. Almost everything they did together. Heber would serve with him as one of the 12 apostles in the LDS church. And so this relationship, when he met Heber, becomes very, very significant in his life for years to come. And it was while they were in Mendon that their second daughter, Violet, was born. And not long after, Miriam began to show the same signs of consumption and became very, very ill and not able to take care of herself or the kids, which left Brigham literally working 24/7, trying to provide for his family. He would get up in the morning, have to do all the household chores that a wife would have done, make the breakfast, get the kids ready, do all of those kinds of things, which was much more in the 1800s than throwing something in the microwave. There's a lot of work involved in all of that. He'd do all of that work and then get Miriam situated, and then he would leave and try to work all day and then come home and take care of the kids and do all the household stuff all night. And so she was very, very ill for a while. All right, it was about that same time in 1830, the young family began to hear rumblings about the Mormonites and their Golden Bible over in Palmyra. And that's where Joseph Smith's from. And Palmyra and Mendon are only about 15 miles apart. So this is all happening in the same neck of the woods. And so April 1830 is when Joseph Smith founded the church. And that same month, Brigham's brother Phineas was, by the way, 3 of Brigham's brothers and one of his brother-in-laws were all Methodist preachers. And so the whole family is very involved in the Methodist Church. And Phineas was on a preaching tour when he stopped in an inn in Minden. And while in that inn, he met Joseph Smith's brother, Samuel, who told him about this new church and about the Golden Bible. And he gave Phineas a copy of the Book of Mormon. And this would become a very fortuitous meeting. Phineas took it and said, I'm going to read it just so I can disprove it. And he read it in that first week and was actually fascinated by it, he said. And he read it again in the following week. He gave it to his dad to read, so Brigham's father. And he read it and said it's the greatest work and the clearest of error of anything he had ever seen. And it passed from him to Brigham's sister, Fanny, who read it and declared it to be a revelation from God. And so it made quite a stir in the young family, and the book made its rounds. It eventually came to Brigham, and he read it as well. And despite all the positive proclamations about it at the time, none of the family joined the church in 1830. It would be a while before they did. Brigham didn't immediately accept the book's divine claims, and like most things, and like a lot of things, he remained skeptical for a period of time. I think this is just an interesting picture. I didn't know where to include it for the first time, but this is the earliest known picture we have of Brigham Young that survives to today. So this is from 1845. So he'd have been already 44 at this point. This is a lot of years after what we're talking about, but that's the earliest picture that we have that exists today. Looks pretty dapper, but that is a really tall hat, isn't it? So, and here he is with his brothers, who are all very important in his life, especially during this time. So, I think they got them. They do have them lined up in order of age. So, from the youngest to the oldest, you got Lorenzo on the left, then Brigham, Phineas in the middle, Joseph Young, and John Young Jr. on the right. So they're wrestling with all of this. In that same period, Joseph and Phineas, who are both Methodist preachers, were traveling, and they came in contact with Solomon Chamberlain. And if you were in the first LDS history class, I know that was a long, long time ago, you might recognize the name of Solomon Chamberlain. He was very important in early LDS history as one of the very first converts and kind of the first missionary of the church. In 1830, he too was a Methodist preacher, but he was out there. He had a lot of revelations from God. He wrote a book that had his own personal revelations from God. And so when he heard that Joseph Smith, this kid over in Palmyra, was having revelations and heard about the Golden Bible, he went to Palmyra to meet Joseph Smith, and so they could confab. And depending on who you talk to, some would say some of Joseph Smith's inspiration and some of what he got was he borrowed from Solomon Chamberlain. But they met early on, before the Book of Mormon was even published, but Joseph Smith gave Solomon Chambers an advance copy of the first 64 pages of the Book of Mormon manuscript. And Chamberlain took that and was wowed by it, and before it had even been published, he was saying that God was doing a new thing. And the very month the church was founded, Chamberlain was baptized, one of the first converts into the church. And in August, Joseph and Phineas come into contact with him, and that has some influence on them. But the real influencing factor was in the fall of 1831, a group of Mormon missionaries from Pennsylvania came to Minden, and they really had a big impact on the Young family in swaying them over to their eventual conversions. And when it all happened really fast. In April of 1832, virtually the whole Young family converted to the Mormon Church. So John Young and his wife, Fanny and her wife, Rhoda Brigham's sister and her husband, Joseph, Phineas and his wife, Clarissa, another sister, Brigham and his wife, Lorenzo and his wife. In April of that year, they were all baptized into the church at the same time. Later in the year, Susanna, his other sister, were baptized. Louisa and her husband a little later, and then Nancy and her husband eventually in 1833. So big family, and all of them eventually become a part of the Mormon Church. Brigham, in telling it years later, kind of overstates his own role in all of that, and in retelling it, years later when he was the guy in charge, made it often sound like he was the one who led all of his family to join the Mormon Church, when that really, in reality, wasn't the case. He claimed, like he says, I claim you as the fruit of my labors. I'm the first that embraced it understandingly. That's not really the case. In reality, Phineas was the most eager to accept, and the reality is Brigham was, just in joining the Methodist Church, he followed his brother's lead. They had all joined long before, and he really didn't want to do anything without Joseph's approval, and he had a big influence on him. So the reality is more that he went along with what his brothers wanted to do. But however it shook out, all of the church, or all of the family eventually joined the church. And the amazing thing is, all of the family became Mormons, and all of them remained faithful Mormons throughout their lives. Which to me is really astounding, because we can't say that about Joseph Smith. A whole lot of his family didn't last very long, and we looked at some of that in the previous class. It's amazing to me that they all joined, and they all stayed and remained faithful. So what on earth was it that convinced them? And it's interesting that it doesn't seem like Brigham ever said you have to really dig. He never said much about his conversion or what led him to convert or what it was that convinced him to believe. So there's just not a lot there. But the few pieces we can piece together is, and all of this is him talking many, many years later. And a lot of us, our memories are a little different looking back than they were at the time. But look, years later, he said, I never really believed any of those other religions in the first place. Long before Joseph Smith published the gospel, I'd lived long enough to learn that the whole sectarian world was ignorant, was in darkness, if they were not in unbelief. But I suppose they were. They were in ignorance. They didn't know God and Jesus. And I was skeptical with regard to the religions of the day. Like there may be a kernel of truth in that, but he was a faithful Methodist. He's just overstating I think, the degree in which he was skeptical of everything else at the time. He was also initially hesitant about the Book of Mormon, he said. Hold on, says I, wait a little while. What's the doctrine of the book and of the revelations the Lord has given? Let me apply my heart to them, and after I have done this, it's my right to know for myself. It took me 2 years before I made up my mind to receive that book. I knew it was true as well as I believed the sight of my own eyes and all of my senses. But he did admit the missionaries who came to Minden made a big impression on him. He said, I praised Christ but disbelieved the religions of the day and thought that their practice was all folly and nonsense. When I heard the gospel, men came to our neighborhood, and he was impressed because they couldn't quote half a dozen passages of Scripture. They couldn't talk longer than every brother here today. Some can only talk, he's talking about like preach, can only talk for 3 minutes, or 11, or 13, or 9. And you're going, Tim, I wish you could only talk for 9 minutes. Right? He's like, they couldn't talk very long, but they brought the power of God with them. And the Holy Ghost spoke through them and spoke to my heart. And I think what really impressed Brigham, the wow factor of these missionaries, and what eventually won him over, or at least I think played a role in it, because we'll see him doing the same thing after his conversion is, right? They didn't talk very long, but they talked in tongues. And they prophesied. And the supernatural element of an ongoing revelation from God, I think, was a wow factor for him. And the spiritual power that they seemed to have, I think, was an important part in winning him over. And so their prophesying, tongue-speaking had a big impact on him. Joseph Smith's claims about ongoing revelation and that God is still speaking today and giving new revelation today was important. And Joseph Smith, the early church, they were big on the imminent gathering. You might recall, right? Jesus is coming back anytime, and all the saints have to gather in Independence, Missouri, because Jesus is coming back any day. And that aspect of this any day return of Jesus, and we're the restored church. Everybody else is wrong, but we've got it figured out. I think all of that weighed into his decision, into his eventual conversion. Whatever the case may be, when Brigham Young did convert, I can say this: he wasn't overstating here. And when Mormonism came along, I fathomed it as far as I could, and I've embraced it for all the day long. That once he threw his hat in the ring, he was unquestionably, unswervingly loyal to Joseph Smith for the remainder of his life, and to the church for the remainder of his life. And Joseph Smith had a huge, huge impact on Brigham Young. But in 1832, they still haven't even met. And how did they eventually get together? And that's where we'll pick up our story next week. So Brigham Young has converted, not next week, 2 weeks, remember. 2 weeks will be our next class. Brigham Young has converted, but how did he go from Brigham Young, the poor carpenter in Minden, to Brigham Young, the leader of the 12 apostles? We'll look at that together next week. God bless you. Hope you have a great week. I can hang out for a minute if anybody has any questions. Thanks for being here.